as one of them. And he's going to talk to us today about rules for rebels, which also seems a bit controversial. Welcome, Mikeal.
Hiya. Hey, everybody. So what I'm really going to talk about is building new communities. And the reason that this is called Rules for Rebels is that most new communities in technology today really are rebellions of some kind. You're always by creating anything new at this point, you're saying everything that came before, or at least the established things before, aren't good enough or don't work anymore for these use cases or whatever. So all of what I'm going to talk about today comes primarily from my experience in two of these rebellions. One, which is you've probably seen, is IOJS, which was really the contributors to Node.js deciding that we weren't very happy with the governance model and the ownership of the project and forking it and moving on, and eventually now coming back together and running the Node project. The other one was actually Node.js itself. Now it's like everywhere and it's like taken for granted. But 6 years ago when we started on this, we were crazy, and everybody thought that we were crazy, and people hated us. People hate us now, but they really hated us just for existing at the time. And when you think about it, Node.js was this new JavaScript platform that didn't run any JavaScript that had ever been written for the web because it didn't have the DOM, right? And then to top it off, if you were going to create a new language or a new VM or any of these projects, you'd also use all of these old C libraries that everybody has and binds to. And we can't because we're all non-blocking I/O, and they all have these blocking I/O structures underneath them. So we were literally just incompatible with everything that had ever come before. And it was this kind of crazy rebellion that turned out working and really taking off and winning. So this is one of the most famous quotes maybe ever. You see it all the time whenever anything sort of revolutionary comes up. It's this old Gandhi quote. And if you've ever been involved in anything like a political movement that actually succeeded, which is very rare, or if you've been involved in any of these little rebellions, it's very interesting because it's just so true. You can even think about a rebellion as being in 4 stages, and you can tell which stage you're in by how your opponents are treating you. And in Node.js, these stages took about 4 or 5 years. And in IOJS, this happened in 4 or 5 months. And a lot of the reasons why it was so accelerated was because we had learned so much in the Node community about how to build these new communities that everything took off and we succeeded really, really fast. Okay, so let's start with what you do when people are ignoring you. So you want to move really, really fast. It's actually your biggest advantage to move really, really fast when you're brand new. You have no dependencies. Nobody depends on you, so you can break whatever you want. And that is not going to be true forever. And it's really interesting. You would think that being brand new would have this huge disadvantage that nobody knows you yet, nobody knows how to write anything in your platform. Where are you going to find people that give a shit? There's actually an eclectic collection of people that just migrate from early adopting one thing to another. And they're awesome, but they'll show up whenever you do anything new, and they'll be really excited. And then in the early days of Node.js, this is not an exaggeration, Ryan would break everybody's code that had written anything in Node.js weekly. There would be 3 or 4 releases a week, and he'd break everything. Yeah, I have a talk that I used to give about basically getting to requests proxy feature. But the first program I ever wrote in Node.js was a proxy, and it broke 7 times, and it changed dramatically with each of those breakages. And when you're moving fast and you're breaking all of this stuff all the time, your community gives you all this feedback on every breakage, and you really quickly end up at some really good ideas, and you form this really nice bond with your early contributors. And the more that you kind of make noise about all of the stuff that you're doing, the more that the people that are ignoring you kind of they lose by default and you win by default because you're talking to people and people are hearing about you and they're not saying anything. So that's a really big advantage that you have when people are ignoring you. The next thing you want to make sure that you do is limit your scope. Too many new communities try to boil the ocean. And probably the most successful thing about Node.js coming up was that Ryan had a really good understanding of what he cared about doing and really didn't want anybody to ask him for anything outside of that sphere. So that's why Node.js doesn't have a giant standard library like most other languages. Ryan was just totally uninterested in writing that and maintaining it and dealing with people's pull requests. So he was like, no, that's not going to be in my project. It wasn't like, some grand foresight. It was literally just that's what he wanted to do. But it's really great to limit your scope as a community because what you're essentially saying is that we're defining ourselves not just by what we do, but by what we don't do. And really good communities and good projects, they're productive because everybody involved knows these are the things that we work on, and these are our metrics for success, and everything else is not our problem. We might care about it, we might work on it outside of this community, but it's really important that we're limited to this little bit of scope. The next thing you want to do is you want to establish a culture or subculture. I don't mean this in the douchey startup way. This isn't about whether you're a foosball company or a ping pong company. This is really about people culture, right? Culture is about people. Software projects tend to be about software and code, but if you want to actually create a sustainable project, you have to care about these people-to-people connections, and the people in the community have to become friendly with each other and really want each other to succeed. I mean, I've worked at about 5 companies in the last 6 years, but I've been in the same culture, and I have a lot of the same friends, and we have a lot of the same cultural events like this that we go to, and that's these cultures sustain much longer than most of what other people do in their professional lives. So it's really important that you sort of put a stake in the ground and say, hey, we're going to have a lot of these cultural artifacts coming through. That said, write things down. Don't just rely on cultural norms to enforce everything about your project. You really need to write down your policies and write down the things that you do figure out culturally. We didn't do this very well in Node.js, actually. This is something that the community came to kind of later, and when we did IO.js, we knew that this was important, and we saw how amazing it was at getting new contributors on board. Because the path to contributing to Node.js was so not understood. We understood it if we'd been around for 6 years, but other people just couldn't figure that out. And so when we started up IO.js, we were like, what is all the paths to get contributorship here? What are the things that people need? Let's document all of this so that we lower the barrier to entry. And when you start thinking about building communities that are more diverse and that have, people from different languages and cultures, it's really important not to rely on cultural norms to enforce access to the project, because what they do is they create these barriers to entry that are imperceptible to everybody who's in a position to change them. So everybody who could actually change some of these policies, they don't see them because they've already accepted the culture. But for everybody trying to get in, for every new contributor that comes and for every new person that comes to your community, they don't see how to get in. And you remain really homogenous. Whatever your core group of people looked like when you established a culture, it never changes because of that. And this is probably the most important thing that you need to do, which is be really nice and then get rid of anybody who's not. People that want to come and be a dickhead don't deserve to be in your project, and they're not entitled to anything. And I created this Venn diagram because Venn diagrams make everything more true. And so there's this weird narrative going around right now that we need diversity of types of people. And when people are actually just straight up hostile, we need to be accommodating to them because we need to be accommodating to all kinds of people. The problem with that is that there's not a lot, there's a good amount of people that will tolerate really disruptive people like that and will be in a hostile environment, and those people might be nice, but they're a fraction of the amount of people that won't participate in a project if it's openly hostile and if everybody's being a dick to each other. I've put my toe into projects and jumped way out because of this, right? And you can tell right away when a community is like that. So part of being inclusive to people literally is figuring out how to exclude people that are going to be hostile and going to be a barrier to other people getting in. We were really good at this in the early days of Node in IRC and haven't been as good longer term. But in the early days, I credit Emily Rose with most of this. She was just kicking everybody who was ever mean in there. It was great. I wish that she still had the time to do that personally. And then just don't go negative. Like, when people are ignoring you, and especially later on when people start, like when your opponents really start to get aggressive, don't go negative. Talk about what you're good at. Talk about what you like to do. Don't go negative at them, because you're not really trying to convince your opponents that you're right. Who you're speaking to is the audience who's watching all of this happen. And if that audience sees you being negative, they're going to be like, that project is full of negative people. I'm not going to hang out with them. All right. So once they stop ignoring you, they start ridiculing you. I hope people remember this happening. This was hilarious. Yeah. So we all know what that looks like. So the best thing to do when you're being ridiculed is not to accept the premise. So when people start ridiculing you, what they're really doing is they're playing up their own strengths. They're going after the things that you're bad at or that you don't have yet to play up their own strengths, right? So you can't win by accepting the premise of their argument. You actually have to kind of go around it. So in the early days of Rails, you saw the Java people really ridicule them for being slow. And what the Ruby people said was not like, oh, we're going to have a benchmark war now. They said, well, we optimize for developer time. And because we optimize, and because like developers are more expensive than servers, like it doesn't really matter that we're slower. When Node came up, all the Ruby people basically ridiculed us and said, you're not optimizing for developer time because callbacks are hard. We're way better on developer time. And then we said, well, you know what? Like if your app is mildly successful and you have 12 servers up and like dedicated ops people, that's also not optimizing for people. So even if we're like a little bit more hard to write an application in, we're actually a lot easier to manage and to deploy, and you don't need as many servers and you don't need as much money on infrastructure. The best story that I have about this, actually, about that in particular, is Instagram. So my friend Mike Krieger is one of the founders at Instagram, and like a year or so after they put up their search API, I think it's their search, yeah, and their search API is like one of their only real-time APIs. So like you give it the search term, and then just as things come in, like you get stuff out of it, right? Most of their stack is in Python, but you're not going to do that in Python. Like anytime that you're going to just hold onto a process indefinitely, or hold onto a socket indefinitely, don't do that in Python. So he wrote it in Node, and this is like Node 04 or something. And so I saw him like a year and a half later, and I was like, oh, how did that Node thing go? He's like, we kind of forgot about it. Like it's up and running, and it's on like one machine on Upstart, so maybe it crashes sometimes, but I don't really know. And we've just stepped away, and it runs, and it's fine, and we've gone on with our day. We haven't even upgraded Node on it yet. I was kind of blown away by that because Node 04 was terrible. I guarantee that process is crashing sometimes from memory leaks. But that was great, right? And that really, like, those kinds of stories are the things that really pull the air out of the argument that people were trying to make at the time that we suck at developer productivity or whatever. Okay, so now that your project is getting a little bit more established, you want to start distributing authority. So any decision that is only made by a single person, get everybody who cares about that decision involved in making it. Give everybody who's contributing something to that decision some kind of authority to make it. And whenever you start to see a small selection of people really taking on a specific task, break that out into its own group and give them autonomy over that task. So don't create these hierarchies where you have like, a core team that like, all these little groups report into, and like everybody, and you have to like get approval from all of these different steps. That's terrible, it doesn't scale, and people hate it. What people want to do is that they want to feel like they own something, right? They want to feel like their name is on it when they put it out, and they don't want to feel subservient to like some boss. I mean, like open source, for the most part, is driven by intrinsic motivation. By that, I don't mean that everybody working on it is doing it in their free time. Most people aren't. But the people that are doing it in their work time could choose any other project. And so they're still pretty intrinsically motivated in what they want to be doing and what they work on. And they don't want to work on your bugs and what you care about. So Dale Harvey was talking about this a bit earlier with the Level Up project and how they use this open source philosophy. So that was pioneered by Rod Vag, who runs the Level Up project. And what that really was our ideas about governing and maintaining a project catching up with our tools. So the reason that we have all of these like crazy systems around getting commit bits is because you used to be able to really fuck up a repository, like almost irrevocably. Like, I mean, I don't know how many of you used CVS back in the day, but like you could really mess up a CVS repository if you didn't know what to do. And you could still do the same thing to Subversion later as well. You can't mess up a Git repository like that. Like the kinds of things that you used to be able to do to mess up a project are impossible in Git. You literally can't. There's nothing in Git that you can't undo. So why are we guarding access to the Git repository so much when everything is revocable and we can come back if we need to, right? And what this really comes down to is value. Like everybody wants to see value out of their project. And if you create something and it starts to take off and there's a community around it, it's much more valuable. And it even becomes more valuable to you the more that you give up your exclusivity on ownership to that. And so the next bit that is really important is to really enable the people that come to contribute. It's not enough to just say, okay, hey, you commit now, or like you have access to this now. You can theoretically do anything. Most people don't automatically assume that they have the right and the ability to do that. Back in January, we started to think about the internationalization story in Node and IOJS. And so one of the early things that the IOJS community did was we said, okay, let's get some international people together and let's start like translating some of this stuff. Rather than create a bunch of groups of translators who we like throw work at like down some kind of pipeline, what I decided to do was say, okay, for each language, let's like spin up a little group and just let them run it and decide whatever they want to do. But like just giving people a space saying, okay, now you have this repo and you're in this team and you have access, go. Most people won't feel like actually enabled to go. So what I did was I logged an issue and I said, hey, if you're interested in being part of the internationalization community in IOJS, just give me your username on this thread and what languages you speak, and I'll add you to those teams. So I'd spin up a repo and a team, I'd add them to it, and then I'd log one first issue. It was the same first issue in all the repositories, and it said, go get a Twitter account for your localization team, figure out how you're going to share that among your team, go get a few other resources, figure out where you want to put blog posts and stuff like that. Like I wasn't telling them where to get it. I was just telling them to go and get access to it so they know and they understand that they own those resources. And then essentially I said, hey, like here's like the weekly updates. Feel free to like go and translate one of those first or whatever you guys feel like doing. And I also didn't give them a process by which they could coordinate with each other to do that. Everybody figured it out. And most of the groups came up with totally different ways to do that. And this was so wildly successful that in the first day, we had 146 people sign up to do internationalizations. Like, none of the official Node.js resources have ever even been localized before. And in a day, we got 146 people over 27 languages. Now it's like well over 200 people in over 30 languages. And there's like a ton of activity there. Another really interesting thing about this was that we said, these are autonomous communities that speak a language among each other. So we didn't break it up by localization. So we don't have a Brazilian Portuguese team and like a Portuguese team, right? We just have a bunch of people that speak Portuguese. And the same thing with Spanish. And they're all responsible for producing all of those localizations if they choose to. But one of those communities decided that they were going to produce all the localizations. And the other one said, you know what? Like it's actually enough for everybody in our community to just have one like standard. So we're all going to work together on that. And those kinds of differences in culture, like we never would have known at the top level IOJS project. Like we could have never made those kinds of decisions. So by creating these autonomous units that were enabled to make their own decisions and their own processes, we ended up at like the ideal place for all of these localization teams. Okay, so now you want to start to grow the community. The reason why this is a great time to grow your community when you're being ridiculed is that it makes it really easy to reach people that your opponents haven't reached. One big one is diversity, because like everybody sucks at diversity pretty much. So if you do a better job at it, you're going to reach a lot of people that have been put off by other projects. But first of all, don't do outreach if you still have a hostile community. So if you haven't like ejected assholes, like don't go recruit people for that. That's really irresponsible. Don't do it. But if you're confident that your community can support diversity, people aren't just going to show up. Like you have to go out and do real outreach and really put yourself out there and go to where people are that aren't like your community already in order to get them and pull them in. once you start doing that, you really need to quickly enable new people to be leaders in those communities. So on the international community side, all of those people, a lot of the people who were really active there have now become leaders in those communities. In the really early days of Node, we were really lucky to have a lot of amazing women and transgender and people of color show up, and they became leaders in different parts of the community because we didn't say, okay, unless you have a commitment on core, you can't manage IRC. Or if you're not affiliated with the main top-level project, you can't run a conference or a meetup. We distributed all of this. We had autonomy over all of this. And so you saw a lot of people who were coming in from the diversity work that we were doing become leaders in these communities. NodeBots in particular has a lot of amazing female leaders in it. It's awesome. And just get comfortable with the idea that work's never going to be done. You're never going to be where everybody needs you to be in the world, in the diversity work. Right now, moving the needle from 0 to 2 is considered a giant success in tech in this area. And that's just not enough. And also, when you start to enable a lot of the people from those communities to be leaders, they start to enforce newer, better standards in your community. So even if you're doing better than every other open source project, that's not going to be enough because everybody's holding themselves to a higher standard. So yeah, just get comfortable with that. It's fine. All right, the last thing that you should do is really limit what you do as a core project and try to encourage people to depend on you. So grow an ecosystem on top of you that depends on you. The people that depend on you are much bigger advocates for your project than the people who work on it. The people who work on your project sit in the bugs in your project all day. They kind of hate your project. They love it, but they also hate it. When they go and speak about it, it's really hard for them with a straight face to be like, oh my God, it's so awesome, when they know that there's this terrible memory leak that they've got to go fix. But the people who depend on you really love you and are really invested in your success. So it's always better to grow an ecosystem around you than in a core project. And this isn't something that's just applicable to something like Node.js, which is a core platform. If you look in the Node ecosystem, there's a ton of really tiny sub-communities that have really similar patterns, right? So Level Up is one. Level Up is a single project that has a compatibility layer below it and above it that it enables in its community. You look at the Grunt ecosystem and all the crazy plugins that are there, or the Gulp ecosystem. It's very similar. It's better to have people depend on you and to invest in you as a dependency than it is to grow all the features in your own core. And this gets back also to what we're talking about when you want to limit your scope. Growing a diverse ecosystem helps you limit your scope because now the community that depends on you is going to reinforce what you shouldn't be doing. And again, don't go negative. Even if you're being ridiculed by the guy who's Node is slow, just don't get mad at him and angry at him. Your audience isn't him. He's never gonna write Node, and you don't want him to. Really, you don't. And what you want are all these nice people that are watching. So just talk about what you're good at. All right. So then people really do actively fight you. And this is an interesting one. So this was the only strategy that seemed to make sense to me. You just act like you've already won. Just okay. It's like you're walking into a boxing match, and while they're getting warmed up, you're like, all right, I'm done. And people are starting to, we've seen enough of these technology trends where something kind of takes off, and we've seen enough of the backlash against those technologies that are coming up, that once people start to really fight you, it is kind of a foregone conclusion that you're going to win, and the people watching have got come to expect this. So the best thing to do is just keep tell people what you're good at and keep talking about all the amazing stuff that you're doing. All of the people that are established that are going to be your opponents when you're in this fight, they have the benefit of the doubt on their side. That's what it means to be the status quo, is that you get the benefit of the doubt. So the only way to put them on the defensive is to actually have this new narrative about all these things that you're just way better at than anybody else. So all of a sudden, they're being asked questions about why aren't they good at this? Where's the amazing concurrency primitives in Ruby and Python? And they start to be asked these really uncomfortable questions that they don't want to know. They don't want to answer. So yeah, just keep talking about your accomplishments. And by now, you've got a lot of great stories and about things that you're just better at than anybody else in the entire world. So do that. Again, don't go negative. Please don't go negative. It's the worst. Even when you're in a fight, just don't go negative. Just avoid their punches until they wear out. Eventually, everybody wears out. Most of this stuff is really just a war of attrition. Just keep doing your thing, and everybody will fade away. All right, so this has been the hardest one for me to get used to. When I was younger, I was involved in some radical political organizing and stuff, and I worked on the largest anti-war protest in the history of the world. And spoiler alert, the Bush administration still invaded Iraq. So in political movements, you don't win very often. It's incredibly rare. And so it's been great to be a part of software movements where you actually get to win. But the first thing that I noticed is just shut up. As soon as you win, just don't keep doing the stuff where you go out and talk about all the things that you're great at, because now it's gloating, and you just come off like an asshole. Really, just stop. And another really important thing to do is to leave an exit for your opponents. You were always fighting for the future. You're fighting for the growth in the people that haven't been programmers yet, or haven't found programming accessible, or just haven't been able to get involved before. You're looking to the future. You can actually leave the past to them, and that's their exit, right? They can hold on to their success, and be okay with it, and be happy with it, and everybody gets to win. We get into this a lot, especially in IOJS, where nobody's going to admit oh yeah, you all were right and we were wrong and I'm sorry. That doesn't happen. That never happens. I'm never going to get an apology from that no to slow guy. Never, ever going to happen. But who cares? I don't want to care about him. And really the last thing once you've won is to start to be really, really honest with yourself and with your community, and be really introspective. There was a great thing recently, and you talk about what you're bad at and be honest about it and try to fix it. But there was a thread on Twitter recently where somebody in the community really called us out on not having any women in the TC yet. And the main thing that stuck out to me about that was I was oh wow, we're at the point where people actually care enough about this to start to work on it. It's only been 5 months. I'm used to people not giving a shit. And then it was okay, well yes, let's do this work. Let's make that better. There's always new work to be done. Let's get on it. It's better to be introspective and to look out for things that might be failing than it is to just, bask in your own success. I mean, at the time where Node had definitely won, I mean, NPM had eclipsed every other package ecosystem in packages. It was being used in enterprises and startups and everywhere. It couldn't be going better. Core was dying. Releases had stopped. New contributors had stopped showing up. The existing contributors stopped doing anything. Basically, it was just Fyodor. That's it. He's the only guy committing code for a while. And that was because we weren't being introspective enough. We weren't being honest and looking at the project at the time. We were too busy trying to grow everything else. And that was kind of the beginning of IOJS there. So yeah, that's my talk. And I'm sorry I'm way under time. I'm used to 20-minute talks. I'm sorry. This is more than 20 minutes. So yeah, I'm Mikeal Rogers. I run evangelism at Modulus. And I guess now I sit on the couch. All right.
Please do.
I'm going to get the water real quick.
Good idea. So I think that's really interesting. Oh, okay. We're getting late in the day. We can kick back a bit. I've worked in building up a few communities myself, so I'm recognizing a lot of the things from your talk. And I think especially this thing about if you're going to have something sustainable, you need to create a culture, and you actually need to be, well, you don't have to be, but it helps if you're conscious about what culture you're building.
Yeah, it's about the people, right? And I mean, there are certain people that they get really comfortable with a homogenous culture, right? And they're not that open to bringing in new people. And if you build that up too much, it actually becomes intractable. And so that was something even really, really early on in the Node days, me and Isaac Schluter would talk about this a lot. Like we had dealt with some communities that did a really great job and some that didn't, and we'd been in really nice communities like Django and had to deal with some really hostile communities like Rails, and we really like kind of put it down to like, we want a nice community, we want to do this right, like what are the kinds of things that we can do? And some of it worked and some of it didn't. We tried to copy as much of that as possible when we did I/O. So
you had a really conscious approach to the whole culture building.
Yes. I mean, if you look at, Isaac started enforcing guidelines in IRC, I think, within the first year of the project, and promoted people to administer it within the first year of the project. And those are probably, I mean, in terms of like documented policies for behavior, probably the most restrictive in terms of like cutting out bad behavior. And also in that first year, were aggressively enforced. I mean, really aggressively enforced. So yeah, I mean, there were a lot of things that we were really conscious of. I mean, obviously we made mistakes. Obviously it wasn't good enough, but we definitely tried, you know. So
one of the things you're talking about is sort of how diversity isn't actually tolerating everyone. And I think that probably comes back to what you were saying then, is that you have these policies and you enforce them aggressively.
Right.
When you were agreeing on those policies, was that like a simple thing to do?
No.
Like, what was the process around that? You know, I'm guessing you didn't all just sit down and sort of went like, be nice, wrote it on a piece of paper and said that.
Yeah. Well, there's a really long history to all of this, but like stuff like the project code of conduct, right? Like some lawyers at Joint decided that they couldn't do that, and that was like a big problem for a while. Also, I mean, we had a hard time at a certain point distinguishing between people that were legitimately just like in their core, just like a dickhead, and people that were really at the end of their rope in a really bad like governance process. So I mean, it's actually funny because you can go and look through. I mean, I'm definitely not going to call out any names, but like the BDFL model in Node.js towards the end got really hostile. Because what happens with the BDFL model is that you have all these people that have been putting years into this project. And they have to fight with one person to get all their stuff in. And eventually they start fighting with each other too. And there's no incentive for the BDFL to convince everybody else that their decision was correct. And there's no incentive for these people to convince anybody but the BDFL. And that created this really hostile situation around core where it was like really hard to talk about things and contribute. And when we moved to a consensus-seeking model where it's not pure consensus, not everybody gets a veto. It's just we try to reach a consensus. If we can't, we can vote, majority wins. So there's always a threat of a vote. We've actually never had to go to a vote. Just the threat of a vote is enough where if you don't want to put in the political capital and the time to convince everybody, you're just not going to try to fight it, right? And what's happened is that like it's gotten so much nicer, so much quicker. And I mean, you know, we went from we never had more than 8 active contributors to Node. We now have 34 contributors to IOJS before the merge. Now that we did the merge, there's like 5 or 6 more. So we're like approaching 40 regular contributors now. That's a pretty dramatic shift, and even just the behavior of some of the other people shifted quite a bit.
So would you say that IOJS is definitely better than Node.js now?
Well, I mean, now we've kind of merged back together, and all of the policies that we created in IOJS have taken over Node.js now inside of the Node Foundation. So we definitely won, but that's nice. So yeah, I mean, the policies were definitely better, and eventually even the people at Joint saw that these policies were better, and they were working, and they were producing a lot more contributors, a lot more progress, and a lot more releases.
So, I mean, you got like a pretty definite thing there where you know that you won.
Yeah, that's really rare.
I mean, how do you know?
You usually know by how people treat you. Like, honestly, like by how people are reacting to you. Like, if they're still trying to fight you, or if they're just trying to hold on to whatever they had before. Like, you mainly know where you are in that process by how other people react to you, which is interesting. And I mean, also, like, winning doesn't mean taking over like the whole internet, right? I mean, by that definition, nothing has really won since PHP. But it's really about like, okay, how much of the new growth that's happening? Because there's always more available growth.
Yeah.
Like the development community in general doubles about every year. That's crazy, right? So that means that next year there will be as many developers as now. Like that's just the growth of technology in general. And open source growth is actually it's like a greater version of that. And so when you look at like module growth of different ecosystems, right? All of the ecosystems have pretty stable percentage quarter-over-quarter growth. So if you look at their growth as a percentage of their existing community, they have just as many people writing that as they did before, right? What I was saying for a while when I was talking about ecosystem growth is that there are probably more individual COBOL programmers today than at any other year when COBOL was super popular. It's just that them as a percentage of the overall programming community is very, very tiny. And so what you're going for is like that growth and all of these new people and people that haven't been able to program before and people like artists and teachers that didn't find things accessible. So when you're going for growth, you've really won once you're capturing much more of the growth than everybody else is. And so that's where Node is. And, Ruby's actually down a little bit. I didn't think that I would see that, but Ruby's down a little bit. Python's down a little bit in terms of growth. And PHP has, taken off again. So, there's, 2 growth communities right now, and one is PHP. Amazing.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So you talked a little bit about diversity, and I just want to go back to that a little bit. Where you're saying that you have to do outreach and you have to keep doing that. I mean, can you just share some examples of how you do that kind of outreach?
Well, so a lot of people have done different stuff, and it's certainly different. If you're a woman or a person of color, you can actually go back into your communities and get people, and that's a lot more valuable. Me and Max Ogden did a bunch of work around Node School, and what we were trying to do with Node School really was go after people who didn't find programming accessible if we could. So where do we find artists and teachers, right? Where do we find people that just aren't programming? And in Oakland too, there's a big open data movement. So there's a lot of people in the civic government that would love to crunch some data and would love to have see an open data tool chain for that. So we would try to actively go after those communities. And when you go after communities that are already more diverse, you end up bringing in more diversity, right? I've always been saying to the people that are going into colleges and trying to get up the number of women applicants, I'm like, why don't you go into an art school and teach everybody programming? Because they already have a much better distribution of women into that school. And honestly, we probably need more artists that are trained in programming right now than we need people formerly trained in computer science doing programming. And as all of this moves its way up the stack, what we need are really creative people. And we're, unfortunately, especially in America, you're not going to find them in colleges that often. The school system in America really likes to beat creativity out of people whenever it can. But some people survive. Jen Schiffer made it through the system, and she's incredibly creative. But
that's very exciting. So with all that diversity work, why is there still 0 women at the IOJS TC?
So for a couple reasons. One is that the TC was sort of spun up and founded with really just the people that have been contributing to Node forever. Yeah. And then a couple people came in that had been working on Node stuff forever, but were now working on core stuff. And then it didn't really grow for a while. We didn't really know. There's this weird thing right now in IOJS and now in Node.js where the TC has 2 responsibilities. One is being this kind of final gatekeeper on any contentious issues that make it into core. So those tend to be highly technical and highly low level. And the other one is basically being the de facto governance organization for the whole project, right? And those for one of those tasks, they actually look like the current contributorship. So the problem there is that we need more diversity in the people that are contributing to low-level core. But the other side of what they do, the actual project administration stuff, we actually have, project-wide, we have a much more diversity, right? And that group doesn't look anything like that. So one of the things that we just started doing before the merge, actually, was starting to grow the TC and grow some more people that had greater experience all around the project. So, it's something that we're working on. But, we've inherited a lot of Node's legacy on this, and we need to be a little bit more conscious about fixing it. I think that it's all happened so fast, right? We forked in Thanksgiving, basically, and now it's already come all the way back around. So it's okay, wow, that was really quick. These policies seem to work.
Non-American Thanksgiving is in the autumn
it's
sometime?
November.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yeah. So it happened so fast, and we're okay, well, now we need to sit down and really work on the diversity work again. But it's not project-wide, it's not nearly as bad. Yeah. This is specifically a core issue, Node core issue. I mean, like I think the hardware group may be more women than men right now. That may not be true, but like I know that there's like 4 or 5 women in that group. You know, the main person who's administering all of the internationalization stuff is a Japanese woman as well. And she's really like the de facto leader of all of the internationalization stuff. Like I don't even know what's going on anymore. Yeah. So I mean, project-wide, it looks much better. And one of the things that I think we want to do once we're all set up with the foundation and everything is find a way to make the project administration part of it look more like the project as a whole so that we solve that problem. And then also figure out, okay, why can't we get more diverse people in the core? What are the issues there just in contributing to core where this is a problem?
Cool. So when you're talking about diversity, you're also saying something like the BDFL model. And would you sort of say that can never work? Because obviously Linux and Python are examples of stuff being built with that model at least. Would you think that they don't work?
This is going to get me in trouble now. Okay, so you can say that they work, but what are you comparing it to, right? Like they work. Like things are still happening, but could they be working better? Could there be more contributors? Like you don't really have a lot to measure that against. I mean, Linux is so successful of a project that you could literally, like, Linux could literally say, like, everybody who wants to get code in has to, like, send me a picture of themselves, like, giving me a high five. And people would just jump through that ridiculous hoop to get code into Linux, right? Because, like, it turns out that, you know, when you're the most distributed operating system in the world, like, you can do whatever the hell you want, and people will still give you code. And, you know, on the Python side, I mean, Guido, like, there's like at the foundation they have like a pretty broad representation to run the foundation, and I think that there's also like a lot of people that get input into Guido. He's not as unshakable, I would say, as Linus is. But also, I mean, Python broke their entire ecosystem to make print a function, and there's a noticeable like lack of growth in the ecosystem when that happened, and they haven't really recovered from it. So is that model working? I mean, the model of like, you know, ignoring what most of the people actually need out of the project and doing what you want to do, I don't think that that's a very good model that's very sustainable. So yeah, I mean, it can probably work for a time. Anything can work for a time. I mean, the BDFL model worked for us for a time. Like, I mean, it worked for Node until it got super huge, and then it became a problem. But at the same time, I think that if we had a better understanding of like how great these governance models worked, we probably would have been even more successful, right? Like, there's always more success to be had out there, and we probably would have had a lot more of it if we had moved earlier. So, and I think maybe some other projects have as well. And if you do want to make some comparisons, like FreeBSD went through a really big shift where they documented all of their contribution policies, did a lot of outreach, really tried to grow the contributorship, tried to get the project back, like going really quickly. And I mean, FreeBSD definitely isn't as distributed as Linux, but they're growing contributors a lot faster than Linux is. And they have like a really healthy localization community and documentation community that Linux doesn't have. So, yeah.
Okay, I think we're going to finish there. Thank you so much. So just a brief reminder that Mikeal is speaking at One Shot on Saturday, and would love to hear your questions about IOJS and the Node Foundation. And you can